I drink my coffee at night. It is evening, and I'm going to be going over chapter number 2, which was the research chapter. So there's going to be a few different things that I'm going to go over in this chapter. One is the actual lecture itself, and then there's going to be some extra stuff towards the end. I do not want to get political about it, but you'll kind of see some of the things I talk about at the end. They're really good things to keep in mind, so it's not anything that you should worry about, but they're very, very, very important things to consider, especially with research, because you cannot talk about research and the importance of the scientific method without talking about what has happened over the past year and a half. So we're going to go into some of that. I don't want to dive too far into it, but at least a little bit. But the first part of this, we're going to be really focusing in on the exercise science part of it. Then afterward, I'll give some more examples and kind of go on a little bit of a spiel that I was going to do last week, but then I decided to just kind of combine it with this. So anyway, enjoy chapter number 2. And I'm going to try to do this to where sometimes you'll see me and sometimes you'll see the slides and all that stuff. So, but anyway, enjoy. Okay, chapter number 2, research and the introduction to research. So let's just go ahead and get right into this bad boy. So first off, we're going to talk a little bit about the research procedures. And that'll be a little bit later on, I guess, in a few slides. But the research procedure is going to be very important because if the research procedures are crappy, if you will, the actual data is not going to be very good. It could not be collected properly. There could be the wrong tests that are used, and therefore the conclusions are not going to be sound. They're not going to line up with what has actually or what could happen in the real world. And we'll talk a little about some of that practical stuff here in a little bit. But when we're discussing the research procedures, everything needs to be as sound as possible. The right tests involved, the equipment needs to be calibrated, the subjects need to be recruited the right ways. The data needs to be analyzed the right way, and the correct conclusions need to be processed and written down. All right, so the types of research. We got basic, applied, translational, quantitative, and qualitative. The last two there are fairly easy, but let's go through them all here. So the basic research, really you're referring to kind of that pure type of research that we generally think of when we go through a research protocol. Maybe you've done some of this in high school, maybe you've done some of it elsewhere too, maybe in some other classes, where you're trying to expand some sort of knowledge and evaluate something. So you might be looking at maybe if this type of supplement will work on weight loss or maybe muscle gain. You could be looking at maybe certain types of workout routines and how well somebody can maybe improve their aerobic conditioning. Sometimes they don't necessarily have to have that practical approach, meaning that we're just trying to figure out or answer a question. That's really what we're doing in science. We're answering questions. We have these dilemmas or these questions, these problems that we want to solve. So we go about formulating some sort of method, and there is a methodology to this, to all of it, to be able to come up with the best answer that we possibly could under the conditions that we expose subjects to, possibly animals or the environment. Now, on the applied side of it, this is really trying to solve some immediate problems, and you're really trying to allow it to, or trying to bring it into the real world, trying to make sure that this can actually be applied. Some of those basic types of research can actually be applied to the real world, not just, hey, we answered a question, fantastic, and just move on. We need to be able to try to apply some of this stuff that we learned from the basic research and apply it to actual training methods, to some sort of rehabilitation, maybe nutritional practices, whatever it might be. So again, we're just trying to apply it to a real world scenario. Real world. That's the hick coming out of me. The West Pennsylvania Now, the translational research, that's a little bit like the applied research in that you're trying to get those findings from the basic research that was done and trying to apply them to health and well-being. So you're trying to find some sort of meaningful way to apply them for healthcare purposes. Maybe improving heart health, or improving or trying to limit someone's reactions to maybe certain foods, maybe improve somebody's diabetes, or other health problems that may ail them. So again, it's a little bit like applied, but you're really trying to focus in on some of those basic types of research. And sometimes there's a line of research that is specific for this, to where you do a bunch of this basic style of research to get these little wee bits and pieces. And then you try to formulate that into the applied and the translational, so that you have some sort of overall theme of what should be applied in the healthcare setting. Now, the quantitative and qualitative are just basically describing what is actually happening, what the methodology is. The quantitative, you're looking at numbers, pure numbers from this. You're getting actual data that we normally think of in research, in scientific research. A lot of times we think of quantitative style of data collection, that you have numbers. So you have height, you have weight, you may have speed, you may have velocity, you may have strength, you may have power, possibly fat mass, you could have muscle mass, whatever the number is, it's an actual number applied to it. Now, on the qualitative side, this is something that you can maybe, in a way, apply a number to it. However, there generally isn't a number. It's, again, qualitative. There generally not any numbers associated with it. So these could be like survey types of questions. They could be interviews with individuals. And again, you're not necessarily getting some sort of numerical values out of them, but you're still getting value from them. These ones can be a little bit more difficult in that, because there is no numbers, the actual way you analyze this data can be a little bit different. And there's actually people that are really, really, really good at, and almost experts in, the qualitative approach to research, especially in our field. Most of the time, however, in our field, we tend to use the quantitative. We generally like numbers. However, there is certainly room for the qualitative. Now, sometimes you can have a mix of them. You can have the quantitative side, where you have all of that kind of pure data that we normally think of: height, weight, age, all that stuff. But then you could have some survey questions about, how do you feel? How do you describe this type of exercise? Or how would you describe yourself after you ate this type of food? Or something like that. So there is a qualitative approach in some research in our area. So a picture here, this was actually from Miami U here in Ohio, just down the road. So this is a picture that they would be of what they would be doing, a VO2 max or some sort of VO2 data. So VO2, and we'll get into it a little bit later on in another chapter, is the volume of oxygen that somebody can utilize. So you're breathing in air, and part of that air has oxygen in it. And we're obviously going to be using that for aerobic purposes and metabolism. And we can actually measure how much somebody is using and utilizing. And that's essentially what this machine does. It's also measuring carbon dioxide that you're breathing out. We have this machine now. Thank goodness. Hallelujah. We have this machine now, and we are going to be using it from now on in our labs. Might not necessarily get to use it in this class, but I do want to, later in the semester, at least show you the equipment and maybe a little bit how it runs and what the pieces are. But that's basically what they're doing here. That's the representation that is shown here in the picture. So you would use this to determine how fit somebody is, how aerobically fit somebody is. So any type of exercise lasting more than, say, 3 minutes, that's what this exercise is going to be using. Some of that goes into the physiology behind aerobic metabolism, because you need at least 3 minutes roughly for aerobic metabolism to start to take over most of the energy production. So that's what it's measuring. So how fit somebody is. Some other types of research in our field, there's a lot of different styles of research. Some of them could be chemical, biochemical, biological in nature, could be measuring gases, but also in the biomechanics side, you can actually start to look at the human body and how the human body actually moves and in what planes and how much velocity there is in the arms or the legs or the torso, or how much twisting and turning and off axis somebody is, and look at the forces that are applied, the angular velocities, the inertia. Some of these terms you may have heard in physics, which that's basically what biomechanics is physics. It's physics of the body, the human body. In this case, it looks like maybe they were looking at a golf swing in this picture, and they were able to map the different parts of the human body. More than likely, they had some sort of sensors on the body, then they were able to track them. In fact, if you ever look at how they create some video games or even some movies now, they're able to put basically suits on, and they have little sensors to where the computer is able to map how those parts are moving. And that's essentially what is being done in some of the biomechanical research with that. They're putting these suits on, or they're attaching some of these sensors to the body, and they're able to determine how the body is actually moving, what speed, what velocity, so how quick somebody is, what the efficiency of the movement possibly is as well. Now, Table 2.2 actually describes some of the areas of exercise science in the basic versus the applied side of the sciences. So we'll just go through a couple of them here, really looking at, let's just say, the exercise physiology part and the exercise and sport nutrition, excuse me. So the exercise physiology, say the influence of muscle pH, or the acidity levels within the muscle, and then the lactic acid, which is generally causing, not necessarily that particular molecule itself, but the some of the other stuff that's associated with the creation of that is causing some of the acidity levels within the muscles. So we're looking at that. So that's just one specific factor. On the applied side, does alteration of whole body pH levels through the use of an ergogenic aid improve distance running performance? So that's a practical application of that basic research that was initially done. You're looking at the pH levels and looking at lactate. Can you find a substance that's able to neutralize that acid that's being produced, and then apply that to the performance side? In this case, it'd be specifically running performance and distance running performance. On the exercise and sport nutrition side, the effect of maybe different meal compositions on muscle glycogen resynthesis. I know that sounds like a big mouthful, but glycogen is the stored form of sugar that we have in our body. So the glycogen is made up of glucose molecules. So glycogen is big, long chains of glucose. So we're looking at different meals and how that's going to affect the composition of that storage of sugar, basically, or of glucose inside of the muscle. So on the applied side, do elevated muscle glycogen levels improve endurance exercise performance? So in the basic side, we're looked at, okay, let's look at what meals could change that glycogen within the muscles. On the applied side, okay, now we maybe found some meals that improve the glycogen levels. Does that muscle glycogen improve endurance exercise performance now? So we're applying it to some type of performance in the real world setting. There's that West Pennsylvania coming out of me again. The real world setting now. Let's look at athletic training in sports medicine. So the effects of different durations of cold application on the change in intramuscular temperature. So obviously ice, maybe cold baths are obviously going to be one application within some sort of therapy. So that's on the basic side. On the applied side, does the duration of the cold application improve healing process of an injured muscle? So we're first in the basic side, we're looking at what were the durations of the cold application and the change in the temperature of the muscle. And then What about the duration in terms of improving the muscle itself, healing the muscle after some sort of injury, or maybe just it could have just been after some workout, possibly some types of high intense exercise. So hopefully you can kind of see the difference between the basic and applied. Sometimes it can get a little bit muddled. I don't know. They may start to look a little bit similar, but you can start to see that the basic is, it is basic. We're looking at maybe one thing, and we're just trying to pinpoint something. We're trying to answer a question, maybe two questions. Then on the applied side, we're really trying to translate that into what happens in the real world, and can it be applied to performance or health, rehabilitation, just in general. All right, some research in exercise science, some of the things that we maybe use at certain points in time. So surveys, interviews, and even observational types of research are used quite often. So the surveys, some of you maybe taken surveys before and maybe been interviewed, or maybe you've interviewed people. Maybe you've even given survey type of surveys out, survey research. So basically just a list of questions that individuals are answering. On the observational side, these are types of studies in which sometimes the subjects don't even know that they are being studied, which is actually a good thing, because if somebody knows they're being studied, sometimes they tend to act a little bit differently. So getting into to a natural setting to where somebody doesn't know they're being studied, and somebody can observe how they're reacting to something, or maybe some things that they are doing in particular, maybe in weight training or some style of exercise modality. One example I can give of this is that there were studies that were conducted that were purely observational, and the researchers went into various different fitness centers, and sometimes they would have the separation of, on maybe one side of the fitness center, there was like ellipticals, there were treadmills, there were cycles, stationary bikes. Then on the other side was the weight room. And they observed and wrote down and recorded who went to either side. And they were really looking at the difference between males and females. It might not be a surprise to some to know that what they found was most of the females went to the aerobic side. So they went to the treadmills, the bikes, the ellipticals, and the males went to the weight room side. So that was a purely observational study. They didn't ask anyone, hey, do you want to participate in a study? We're just going to track you. We're going to see what you do, see where you go in the fitness center. We're going to, and this is our purpose, right? Because if some of the females knew, or some of the males knew that they were going to be studied, they may have acted differently. So the observational research was employed in that method. Now, there are times where the observational research is in a way in which the subject does know. So sometimes you do got to be careful to make sure that they maybe don't react exactly, make sure they do react the way that they would if they didn't know that they were being studied. Sometimes that can be a little difficult, though. The meta-analysis is basically taking large groups of data from various different research subjects, or the same subject at times, and combining it together to create this big, massive style of study. So you're taking data from 1, 2, 3, it could be dozens of different studies, and you're combining all of this data that was very similar or the same and putting it into the program and analyzing it that way. That way, instead of you having these little wee pieces of various studies, you can have this great big study and big pool of data that you can draw from. Historical research, this one is simply, it's already existed. The data was already there. There was already some sort of observation that was made. There were already interviews that were done. There was maybe some data, years ago. It could have been last week, possibly. But it happened in the past, and you're just grabbing that data and applying it to your research protocol. The systemic reviews are simply just taking the studies and looking at them from a systematic point of view and trying to make sure that they are sound. You're trying to appraise them, see which ones are better than others, and then trying to bring the really good ones into kind of a collective pool so that there can be some other, I guess, bigger idea that comes from this. Okay, we have all these different pieces, similar to a meta-analysis, but in this case, you may not necessarily be analyzing data. The meta-analysis, you are analyzing data. The systemic reviews, you're really pulling from a lot of different sources and trying to bring it together into this bigger idea. Okay, how do we, what do we know? And how do we apply all of this now? We have all these good research protocols and all of these good conclusions. Let's bring it together. And then there's randomized control trials. So there's a randomization of people that are being subjects in these studies. So usually there's multiple trials that are involved. Not always, but there's usually multiple trials that are involved in which they might come into the lab or they might be tested multiple different days or multiple different weeks. A lot of times this can be used in really all types of research, the basic and applied styles of research. This style of research also helps to minimize and mitigate some of the biases that can take place in research, especially in drug research, because with the randomized clinical trials and control and the any type of randomized trials, you can have a control group. And that control group can get a placebo or they could not get anything at all. So that's why it's kind of important to randomly recruit subjects and also randomly assign subjects to various different groups. Also in these random trials, generally speaking, neither the researcher nor the person that is taking maybe a certain supplement or getting some sort of treatment knows if they're getting the real treatment or if they're getting something fake. So if it's a drug, it could be a placebo. If they either get a placebo or the actual drug itself. So nobody knows. The actual participants don't know. The researchers don't know either. Usually there's some other third party that has a list of who is actually getting these drugs. And moving on to the research process itself. So the first thing is when you're starting to design a research study, first off, you have to have a question. What is the dang problem? That's really what the first thing should be. From there, you start to design the research study. You maybe have a hypothesis, and this hypothesis could be based upon previous data that was already collected by other people. And with this hypothesis, you're trying to say, I think this is what's going to happen, is basically what you're proposing. And that could be based upon, again, other research that has been previously done. And that's going to be one of the things when you write up a research paper is you collect a bunch of studies and conclusions that's already been completed. And that's more of like a literature type of review. So it's a review of that specific topic. And then you're saying, okay, I think this is what's going to happen in our research based upon what has already happened. And with this, you're going to define what the independent and dependent variables are. The independent variable is the variable that could change. So the one that you maybe are manipulating. The dependent variable is going to be what that independent variable is going to be acting upon. So for instance, if it was a supplement, let's just say it was creatine. Right. Well, actually, let's just say it's caffeine. Since I have some caffeine in my hand right here, you're going to do caffeine on, let's just say, running time to exhaustion. The caffeine would be the independent variable because some subjects may be getting caffeine, others may not. Or everybody is going to get caffeine and everybody's going to get placebo at some point in time. So that means there's multiple different trials that'll be taking place. Sometimes people will come in the first day, they'll be getting the caffeine. Some of them might get the placebo. The next day, the people that got the placebo will get the caffeine and vice versa. The dependent variable then will be the time to exhaustion that somebody is cycling to on maybe a stationary bike. So that would be one example of independent and dependent variables. What is the study methodology? How are we going to go about recruiting subjects? Who are the subjects? What style of maybe exercise are you employing? What the intensity is? What times are they coming into the lab? Are you even doing it in a lab? Maybe you're doing it out in the environment. And how are you controlling for things like wind and heat and humidity and all those things? All those things need to be taken into consideration when looking at the methodology. And then the data collection, how's the data actually going to be collected? When the data is collected, where is it going to be stored? How are you going to put it into a program? Usually it's a computer program you're going to put it into. Excel's a good one. You can put it into Word, possibly, especially if it's qualitative. You may have to put it into Word, some sort of Word file. But the data collection a lot of times is going to be put into statistic style programs to where you can then analyze the data. And there's going to be different processes you go through of analyzing it certain ways, depending upon how the methods were set up. And we're not going to go into that style detail. You'll get that later on in the thesis. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then interpreting the results. This one is important, very important. So you have this data collection and then analyzing the data. You have to interpret what that data showed. That's the important part of this. You can go through all of this, get this research done, but if the interpretation of the results isn't there, what was the point? You didn't answer the question at all. So you need to interpret the results. That interpretation of the results is usually a discussion style session when it is written up in maybe some sort of research protocol and research journal. Speaking of a journal, that disseminating the findings, that is what that is. You are giving it out to the public. Everyone else, usually people in the field are the ones mostly reading it, but the greater population, the public, can actually view these findings. And that's really the biggest reason why we do this, is to get this stuff out there. I mean, we don't want to keep it to ourselves. That's kind of somewhat selfish. We want to get it out to the greater population, especially the people within our field. And there's a lot of different steps of going through, of disseminating the findings and going through writing a manuscript and getting it published and all that stuff that we're not necessarily going to go into here. But it is an important part of the research process. All right, so going into evidence-based practice. This is what we need to do. And I'll get into this a little bit more after I get through the PowerPoint here. But we're really trying to get the best evidence that we have of a certain topic, a certain idea, and applying that. That's what we're doing. We have to practice what is based upon the evidence. We can't base it on anything else. We can't come up with some therapy just because, well, we think this might work, or it was an old wives' tale, or whatever the idea is. It has to be based upon evidence, which means it has to be based upon good evidence. Good evidence being the stuff that went through research protocols. So they went through all of exploring what the previous research was, coming up with a research design, a hypothesis, recruiting subjects, making sure the equipment was running properly, analyzing the data, coming up with a discussion or an interpretation of the results, and then disseminating that to the population. And part of that dissemination is actually having a few of your colleagues or people within the field review your paper. And then once that is approved by those individuals, then, and the editor of the journal, then you can publish it and it's out there. And that's part of the evidence that can go into the pool of review for everybody. And you have to base everything off of that. That's part of the scientific method. That's how we vet maybe some of these research protocols that may not necessarily be the best, or maybe some of the conclusions that people come up with that aren't necessarily the best. We'll get into some of that here in a little bit. Some of the pseudoscience that is out there, that's the reason we're doing this. We have to have evidence-based practice. You can't just train somebody just because that's what your coach did or your coach's coach did, and it was all passed down from there. So we have a nice little Venn diagram here. So best evidence from research, from the research, and then you have the clinical expertise, and also some maybe experiences, and then also client patient perspective and input into this as well. And all of this needs to fit in somewhere. So there could be some best evidence from research that shows maybe some sort of practice is the best, but if the clients or the patients aren't having it, or if it's causing maybe too much discomfort or pain, or it's too invasive, or whatever it is, you may have to start to weigh that in a little bit. And then also just the experience itself, in terms of the people that are clinicians. What are they experiencing when you start to apply these things? Are they working in the real world? So that applied style, or that translational style of research that's going into it. So they all three kind of need to meet in the middle somewhere, so that you can improve health. The comfort of the patient, the client is important as well. Do the benefits outweigh the negatives? And then also the people who have experience within the field. How is it actually working in the real world setting? And again, how it works. You can see a list there of the steps and the orders and what the action items are. And this is table 2.5 from this. So you can kind of see some of them there. We're not going to go too far into that. So I think I'm going to end this, at least lecture portion of it. So we'll get back here in a minute. And so again, this was chapter number 2. So yeah, if you wanted to turn it off now, you can, but I'm going to go into a little bit more of why this is important. So stay tuned.